Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? On Wednesday, Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehud in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Lorraine in Texas, Renee in Indiana, Karen in Northern California, Guy in Ohio, Shandora in the Bronx, Lucy in Minnesota, Chaim in Florida, Ella in Southern California, Marjorie in Georgia, Frank in San Pedro, Alan in NYC. Welcome, everybody. Today, with God's help, we're going to finish Chapter 3 here in Tractate Sanhedrin, the 24th volume of the Talmud. Continuing today our discussion of Mishnah number 5 in this tractate, which we'll complete and then open and close, God willing, Mishnah number 6. We pick this up at the bottom of page 30b, and our daf today is page 31. And we've been talking about Mishnah number 5, in which we held, just to remind us, that which witnesses, how are the witnesses examined? How are the witnesses examined? Are they brought in together? Do they have to come in on the same day? How are they intimidated to tell the truth by the judges who questions them, etc.? Okay, bottom of page 30b, Rav Yehuda says the testimony of two witnesses who contradict the testimony of each other in response to the judge's examination of the details of the story is valid in cases of monetary law, although a contradiction of this type disqualifies testimony in cases of capital law. Right, now the witnesses come as a pair, right? It takes two witnesses testifying about the same incident or the same loan, if it's a case of monetary law, for example, for the matter to be established at all. We need the two witnesses. Well, what if the two witnesses don't tell the same story? The question then becomes, well, how and where do they differ? What is it that they differ on? Make a long story short, are they differing on a key detail or an incidental detail, a primary detail or a secondary detail? Let's see how this plays out. Rava says, the statement of Rav Yehuda, right, who says that even if there's a contradiction, we accept the testimonies. Now, the judges are still going to have to evaluate, how much they believe of each witness and how they're going to proceed and issue a verdict. But even though the stories aren't the same, we can hear these testimonies. We don't dismiss the case outright. Rava says, the statement of Rav Yehuda is reasonable in a case where one witness says the money was in a black purse and the other one says the money was in a white purse. Since this is a secondary detail, they may not remember it accurately. But if one says that the lender lent a black coin to the borrower, meaning that the coin was dark, and the other witness says he lent a white coin, meaning that it was a light-colored coin, then the testimonies are not combined. We don't have a joined, two witnesses acting as a pair. And this case would be dismissed. Why? Because the witnesses contradict each other with regard to a characteristic of the money itself. So we doubt that one of them has the true story. Right? What are they testifying about? That the lender lent money to the borrower. So if it's just what the money was stored in, that's one thing. But if they're talking about the money itself, what kind of money changed hands, now we're getting to a much more key detail of the incident. The Gemara challenges Rabbi Yehuda's ruling. And the witnesses contradict each other with regard to secondary details, such as black purses, such as a black purse in a case of capital law, right, where the defendant's life is on the line because he's accused of murder, for example. So is it the case that their testimony is not accepted? But doesn't Rav Chisda say, in a case where one of the witnesses says, the murderer killed the victim with a sword, and the other witness says the murderer killed the victim with an ariran. An ariran. The source of the meaning of this word is unclear. Some claim it derives from the Greek aor, meaning sword. According to the Geonim, an ariran is a bent sword or a knife. A different kind of weapon, right? Clearly, visibly a different kind of weapon. Just for purposes of clarity, we can say one witness says he killed the guy with a sword, and the other witness says he killed him with an axe. Okay, well, this is not congruent testimony, as this is a clear contradiction. We're here to try a murder that was accomplished with a weapon, and the witnesses are disagreeing on the weapon itself. This testimony will not stand. But if one of the witnesses says that the murderer wore black, right, that his garments were black, and one of the witnesses says the murderer's garments were white, well, this is congruent testimony, as this is not a meaningful discrepancy. Now we're on page 31a. So the Gemara answers, are you setting the statement of one man against the statement of another man? Rav Chisda holds that a contradiction with regard to secondary details does not disqualify the testimony, even in capital law, and Rav Yehuda holds that it does disqualify the testimony. Neither sage is bound by the statement of the other. Right? They are both inheritors of a tradition from earlier sages. Right? These are, if you're talking about Rav Yehuda or Rav Chisda, so you're talking about Amoraim, sages of the Gemara, right? Sages after the Mishna was completed. They would have to follow precedents that are set by Tanaim, sages of the Mishnah, who were earlier and more authoritative. So it sounds like they received different traditions and are going to make different rulings where they are the presiding judges in their region. But it sounds like, they must have received different traditions because what they're holding is different from each other. Now, the sages of Nehardea say, even if one says that it was a black coin and the other one says it was a white coin, we do combine their testimonies. So the Gemara asks, well, in accordance with whose opinion is this? Is it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, that as long as both witnesses testify that the defendant owes the plaintiff the same sum, the testimonies are combined, right? Yesterday we were talking about the witnesses were not in the room at the same time, but they come back and say, I saw that Reuven lent Shimon 100 dinars. And the other one says, I saw that Reuven lent Shimon 100 dinars. Now, they weren't in the room at the same time. They weren't present together, but they both saw a loan of 100 dinars. Now, it might be that they saw two different loans, but we can say at the very least, Reuven does owe, lent, right? Reuven did lend Shimon 100 dinars. So Shimon owes 100 dinars. Maybe he owes 200. But at the very minimum, he owes 100 because both witnesses saw that. And they don't have to be in the room at the same time. And needless to say, they don't have to testify on the same day before the court. But we can combine their testimonies. That's what we learned yesterday from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha. So are we going to say that these kinds of details now about the color of the money is not going to be enough to invalidate the testimony for the same reason? Because at the very least, whether the money was dark or light, the witnesses saw money changing hands, and if they agree on the amount, what difference does it make whether the coins were old or new, shiny or dull, etc.? So rather, the sages of Nehardea, So is this in accordance with Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha? Well, say that you heard Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha say that two testimonies are combined in a case where they do not contradict each other, right? Each of them saw 100 dinars being lent. Now, maybe they saw two different loans, but what they're reporting is the same thing. But here, where they do contradict each other, and the two testimonies have a clear contradiction in some detail, maybe they agree how much money was lent, but the money itself, they're disagreeing on it. Would Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha combine those two testimonies? We don't know. So rather, the sages of Nehardea stated their opinion in accordance with the opinion of that Tana, as it is taught in a Baraisa, that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel do not disagree with regard to a case of two sets of witnesses, right? 4 witnesses altogether, 2 pairs, where one pair of witnesses says that the plaintiff lent the defendant 200 dinars, and the other pair of witnesses says that the plaintiff lent the defendant 100 dinars. So both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai agree that this is not considered a contradiction. And the testimony is accepted concerning the amount of 100 dinars, as both sets of witnesses accept that 100 dinars are owed, because 100 is part of 200. So the testimony concerning a large amount includes testimony concerning a smaller amount. So both sets of witnesses agree that 100 dinars minimum was lent. One pair of witnesses says actually it was 200, but the 2 pairs of witnesses all agree that at least 100 was lent. Now, with regard to what do Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai disagree? They disagree over the case of one set of witnesses, right? Just one pair of witnesses, not 4 witnesses altogether, but only 2. So these 2 witnesses have to combine to be a pair, or we have nothing at all. Okay, what if they disagree with each other? As Beis Shammai say, that, so in this case, the 2 witnesses disagree. One witness says that Reuven lent Shimon 200 dinars, and the other witness says that Reuven lent Shimon 100 dinars. So it's the same thing. They agree that at least 100 dinars was lent. But here we don't have two separate pairs of witnesses where each pair, they say the same thing. They each in each pair of witnesses, the witnesses agree with each other. Here we only have one pair of witnesses, and these 2 witnesses disagree with each other on the amount. So are we going to apply the same principle and say, well, they agree that at least 100 dinars was lent? Or are we going to say, well, we only have one pair of witnesses, and they are contradicting each other with the crucial detail of how much money was lent? If they can't agree on that, maybe one of them is lying, maybe one of them didn't really have a good vantage from which to see it. Something is fishy here, and maybe we should throw out this testimony altogether. So Beis Shammai say their testimony is divided, meaning we don't have a congruent pair of witnesses on whose testimony we can rely. Since they are not testifying about the same amount, the entire testimony is disqualified. And Beis Hillel say 100 dinars is subsumed within 200. So apparently, according to Beis Hillel's opinion, as transmitted by Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, although the testimonies are not identical, since both attest to the defendant's liability to pay a certain amount of money, they are combined and accepted at least to the extent of the 100, although they contradict each other on the second 100. This is the source of the opinion of the sages of Nehardea, right? So it seems like if what they agree on is the important part, and we can establish a liability of the defendant within what the two witnesses do agree on, then we will accept that pair of witnesses as congruent testimony, even if they disagree on some of the details. Now, with regard to a case where one witness says that the plaintiff gave the defendant a barrel of wine, and the other witness says that the defendant gave the plaintiff a barrel of oil, there was actually such an incident, and it came before Rabbi Ami. Now, in that locale at that time, wine was cheaper than oil. Rabbi Ami deemed the defendant liable to pay the plaintiff only the value of a barrel of wine out of the value of a barrel of oil, an amount that both witnesses agreed that he owed. Right? Same theory as Beis Hillel. If one witness says 200 dinars were lent and the other one says 100 dinars were lent, okay, well, they agree that at least 100 dinars were lent, so that's what we find the defendant liable to pay. Here, there was one witness said a barrel of oil, which is worth, let's say, 200 dinars, and the other witness said a barrel of wine, which let's say it's worth 100 dinars. So the ruling of Rabbi Ami was, okay, so he owes the value of the barrel of wine, which is the 100 dinars, for the same reason. But the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion is this ruling? Is it in accordance with the opinion transmitted by Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, in the name of Beis Hillel, presumably? Well, say that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said that two contradicting testimonies can be combined in a case where 100 dinars is subsumed within 200. Because perhaps one of the witnesses saw only half the loan and the other one saw the full loan. But in a case like this, where the testimonies are about completely different items, did he say that they can be combined? And the Gemara answers, no, this is not a case of direct contradiction. This ruling is necessary with regard to monetary value. In other words, one witness says that the defendant owes the value of a barrel of wine, and the second one says that he owes the value of a barrel of oil. Therefore, it is comparable to a case of 100 dinars and 200 dinars. And it could be subsumed because they are talking about monetary values, which would imply that if one witness said, I saw him lend the defendant a barrel of oil, and the other witness says, I saw the plaintiff lend a barrel of wine to, confusing myself. If one witness says, I saw the plaintiff lend a barrel of oil to the defendant, and the other one says, I saw the plaintiff lend a barrel of wine to the defendant, this would be contradictory, because now we're not talking about monetary values. It so happens that one is worth less than the other. But the witnesses are testifying two different things about the object that was lent. Here we don't have congruent testimony, and the inference is it would not be accepted. But the Gemara goes on. With regard to a case where one witness says that the incident took place on the upper floor of a house, and the other one says that it occurred on the lower floor. Rabbi Hanina says that an incident like this came before Rebbe, and he combined their testimonies. And this was in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, that since they agree with regard to the matter itself, the secondary details are not significant. The Mishna taught, and from where is it derived, that when the judge leaves the courtroom, he should not say, I deemed you exempt, and my colleagues deemed you liable, but what can I do as my colleagues outnumbered me, and consequently you were deemed liable? About this it is stated, you shall not go as a talebearer among your people in Leviticus 19:16. And it says, one who goes out as a talebearer reveals secrets, but one who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. Right? A person who is a faithful, upright person doesn't go around as a talebearer, doesn't go spilling secrets. This doesn't go around as a gossip. Doesn't speak Lashon Hara. The sages taught in a Baraisa. From where is it derived? That when the judge leaves, he should not say, I deemed you exempt and my colleagues deemed you liable, but what can I do as my colleagues outnumbered me and consequently you were deemed liable? The verse states, you shall not go out as a talebearer among your people. And it says, one who goes out as a talebearer reveals secrets. Sounds like the same holding. Seems like just they have a Baraisa that repeats the information of the Gemara. Of the Mishna. Now the Gemara relates, there was a certain student about whom a rumor emerged that he revealed a statement that was stated in the study hall and should have been kept secret. And the rumor emerged 22 years after the time that the statement was revealed. Rav Ami removed him from the study hall as a punishment. Rav Ami said, this is a revealer of secrets and he cannot be trusted. Loose lips sink ships. Somebody who goes around telling you what other people are saying behind closed doors is not somebody that you should go into business with, not somebody that you should hire, not somebody that you should marry, not somebody that you should befriend. And if you find yourself juicily listening to his juicy secrets, you should question yourself, because that's not good behavior. Neither to speak gossip nor to listen to it. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Now Mishnah 6, the final Mishnah of chapter 3 here in Tractate Sanhedrin. Anytime one of the litigants brings additional proof, he can overturn the verdict that was decided according to previous proofs. If one litigant said to the other, bring all the proofs that you have from now until 30 days from now, then if he found additional proof within 30 days, he can overturn the verdict. But if he found it after 30 days, he can no longer overturn the verdict. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says he can still overturn the verdict. As what should this litigant who sought and could not find additional proof within the 30 days, but he found it after 30 days, what else should he have done? It wasn't available to him until it was available. The proof or the extra witnesses. It wasn't available until it was available. So in a case where one litigant said to the other, bring witnesses, and the other one said, I have no witnesses. And the former said to him, bring a proof. And he said, I have no proof. And then he later brought a proof or found witnesses. In this case, this proof or these witnesses are worth nothing. It is apparently a false proof or a false testimony, since he said, I don't have, right? I can't find is one thing, but I don't have. Like, it doesn't exist. There are no witnesses. There is no proof. Okay, well, then if he finds it later, it sounds like he made it up. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, well, what should this litigant, who did not know that he has witnesses, and ultimately he found witnesses. He didn't know there was a witness there, and then later he learned there was a witness. Or he did not know that he has a proof, but ultimately he found a proof. What should he have done? That's why he can still overturn the verdict. Right? Sometimes you don't know that you have evidence that will help you in a case until later, maybe even after the verdict was given. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, well, if you didn't have proof, you didn't even know it existed, and then later you found out that it did exist, okay, so then you can go to the court and reopen the case. If at the beginning of the discussion in the court, one did not bring witnesses or other evidence for his claims, but then he saw that he was about to be deemed liable to pay in the judgment, and then he said, well, bring so-and-so and so-and-so, and they will testify on my behalf. Or he pulled out a proof from under his belt. Even Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel holds that this is worth nothing. If there was truth in the testimony of these witnesses or this proof, he would not have hidden it until now. Very fishy behavior. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. So with regard to the first law in this Mishnah we just read, Rabbah bar Rav Huna says the law is in accordance with the statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Right? If he found it late, he didn't know it existed, and then he brings it, we reopen the case for him. And Rabbah bar Rav Huna says the law is not in accordance with the statement of the rabbis. Well, the statement of the rabbis is what disagrees with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So what's going on here? One of them says, no, we don't listen to the rabbis, we listen to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And the other guy seems to be disagreeing with him and says, yeah, we don't listen to the rabbis. Well, it sounds like these two guys agree that we hold like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And the Gemara asks, well, isn't that obvious? Since he says that the law is in accordance with the Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, so we know by ourselves that the law is not in accordance with the statement of the rabbis. So the Gemara answers, lest you say that this statement, that the law is not in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, applies ab initio, but after the fact, even if the court ruled in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, we would still find that the ruling is valid, as their opinion was not entirely rejected. Rabba bar Rav Huna therefore teaches us that if the court acts in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, we send the case back to court. Meaning, we hold like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and the case can be reopened if evidence turns up later, like witnesses. So the Mishnah teaches that in a case where one litigant said to the other, "You're saying I owe you money?" I say I don't owe you money. Bring witnesses that I owe you money. And the first one admits, no, I don't have witnesses. But then later he found witnesses. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said that the testimony is valid. Rabba bar Rav Huna says that Rabbi Yochanan says the law is in accordance with the statement of the rabbis. He said, bring witnesses. The guy said, I don't have witnesses. Now he can't bring witnesses. That's the rabbis. Sounds like Rabbi Yochanan agrees with the rabbis. And Rabba bar Rav Huna also says that Rabbi Yochanan says the law is not in accordance with the statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So what they seem to be saying is, guy says, you owe me money. Guy says, I don't owe you money. If you think I owe you money, prove it. Bring witnesses. So if the guy says, well, I haven't found them yet, he can bring them later. But if he says, well, there are no witnesses, you and I both know that you lent me that I lent you money. Okay, there's no witnesses. Then in that case, if later he does bring witnesses, that would be weird, and that's why we don't accept it, and the law is like that. So the Gemara asks, well, isn't it obvious? Since he says that the law is in accordance with the statement of the rabbis, we know by ourselves that the law is not in accordance with the statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. The Gemara answers, the statement of Rabba bar Rav Huna teaches us that specifically, with regard to that law, the law is not in accordance with the statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. But with regard to all other statements of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, in the corpus of the Mishnah, the law is in accordance with the statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So even when Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees with the majority, usually we follow Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Now, this is to the exclusion of that which Rabba bar Chana says, that Rabbi Yochanan says. Anywhere that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel taught a ruling in our Mishnah, the halacha is in accordance with his opinion, except for the following three cases. The responsibility of the guarantor, right? Do we go to the guarantor first, or do we have to first go to the borrower before we go to the guarantor? And the incident that occurred in the city of Tzaidan, where a man declared his intention to divorce his wife on condition that she return his cloak to him. And she said, I lost your cloak. So then there was no divorce, but they said, no, she could just give him the value of the cloak and then she can get divorced. And the third incident is with regard to evidence in a final disagreement, what we're talking about here, which would indicate that we follow the rabbis, not Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, about whether a case is closed or not when later evidence turns up. Whereas in the former dispute in the Mishnah here, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. In the latter dispute in the Mishnah here, the law is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. So Rav Huna, by contrast, maintains that in the case of a guarantor and in the case of Tzaidan, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Now, the Gemara relates, there was a certain child who was taken to court before Rav Nachman. Child, not an adult, a minor. They said to him, do you have witnesses on your behalf? And the child said to them, no. And they continued to ask, do you have evidence? And the child said to them, no. And Rav Nachman said, well, okay, then, they have brought witnesses. They say you owe. So you're liable. You have to pay this debt, I guess from the estate that you inherited from your father. The child was walking and crying. And these people heard him and said to him, "We know about the monetary matters of your father, and we can testify on your behalf." And when he brought them before Rav Nachman said, "In a case like this, even the rabbis concede that the testimony is accepted, as a child does not know about the monetary matters of his father. He said he has no witnesses because he didn't know that he has witnesses. He wouldn't know where to look for witnesses. And that's normal when a child inherits an estate. So clearly, when he said that he has no witnesses or proof, he said so out of ignorance, and he was mistaken. There was no concern that he then later, lied and brought witnesses to testify falsely." So the Gemara relates another incident. There was a certain woman from whose possession a promissory note emerged, meaning she was appointed to hold it, right? So in other words, she was not the lender or the borrower, but she was the one who was asked to hold the promissory note that gave evidence that a borrower had borrowed money from a lender. So now she comes with the promissory note. So she said to the judge, "I have this promissory note, but I know that this promissory note was repaid. So the creditor should not use it to collect," right? So even though it wasn't torn up after the loan was repaid, instead it was deposited with her. She says, "Yeah, it was deposited with me, and I know that the loan was repaid." So Rav Nachman deemed her testimony credible and did not allow the creditor to collect the debt. If the creditor had been holding this promissory note, he would have been able to collect the debt. But since it came from this woman who's a third party, who was entrusted to hold it, and who testified that it had been repaid, we believe her, even though she's a single witness. Why? Rava said to Rav Nachman, "In accordance with whose opinion is your ruling? Is it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi? Is it in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe, who says that letters, i.e. the content of a promissory note, are acquired by merely transferring the document? In other words, there is no need to write a deed for the transfer of a monetary document from one individual's ownership to another. Rather, by giving it to the recipient, he becomes the owner of the document." So in other words, if she's holding the promissory note, actually she has the right to collect that debt. It's like she's the lender. Therefore, since the promissory note is in this woman's possession, she is considered its legal owner, and her claim that it was repaid is consequently accepted, right? If the lender who holds the promissory note says, "Well, yeah, I got repaid," well, then that promissory note can't be used to collect the debt. We believe him because he's the owner of the promissory note. He's not really like two witnesses. He's the owner of the promissory note. So we do accept his statement. Rav Nachman said to him, "Actually, that is not the reason for my ruling. It's not that whoever holds the promissory note is considered its legal owner, and therefore we accept his statement if he says it was already repaid. Rather, in this case, it's different. Here, the woman's claim is accepted in any event, as since the promissory note was in her possession, if she had wanted to, she could have burned it. Therefore, she is presumably telling the truth. She's saying it was already paid off, right? So that means that the borrower doesn't have to pay. If she just lost it, it was her note. If she burned it up, then it's the same result. The borrower doesn't have to pay. She could have just lost it, burned it, discarded it, thrown it away, whatever, and it would produce the same result as her saying, "Well, here's the note, but it's been paid." Since she could have burned it, and instead she just produced it and said it's been repaid, we assume she's telling the truth. Now, some say that there is another version of the story, according to which Rav Nachman did not deem her testimony credible. And Rava said to Rav Nachman, "But if she had wanted to, she could have burned it. Why did you not accept her testimony?" Now on page 31b. So Rav Nachman answered him, "Since the promissory note was ratified in court, we do not say that she is deemed credible to nullify its validity, because if she had wanted to, she could have burned it. The validity of a ratified document is not nullified without evidence. Since it was ratified in court, we're going to need more than some presumption. We're going to actually have to have evidence that it's been paid off, right? Ratified in court that it is evidence of a loan, unless we produce evidence that it's been paid, we're going to assume it hasn't been paid. And one person's testimony is not evidence that it's already been paid. Rava raised an objection to the ruling of Rav Nachman from a baraisa. A receipt, and the word for that is simfon, a receipt of repayment of a debt upon which witnesses are signed is ratified by means of its signatories. The witnesses testify that these are their signatures, and then it's ratified. If there are no witnesses that are signed on this receipt that a debt was paid, but the receipt emerged from the possession of a third party who was serving as a trustee, or if it emerged after the signing of the documents, i.e. the receipt was written on the promissory note beneath the content of the note and the witnesses' signatures, then it is valid. And Rava states his objection. So apparently the testimony of a third party serving as a trustee is deemed credible, as he can testify that the receipt is valid even if it was not signed by witnesses. So why don't we believe the testimony of a trustee with respect to the promissory note itself? And the Gemara concludes, yeah, you're right. The refutation of the opinion of Rav Nachman is indeed a conclusive refutation, and we would accept her testimony. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, from the Jewish community in Israel, the west, to the Jewish community in Bavel, in Babylonia, which is the east. So when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, one can always bring a proof for his claim and overturn the previous verdict, always, but only until his claims are stopped up, i.e., until he has no more claims. And he says, come so-and-so and so-and-so testify on my behalf, in which case those witnesses are not allowed to testify. What? Right, so he can bring further evidence and reopen a case, but he can only do that until he has no more claims. No more claims, okay, he has nothing else to claim. No other debts that are being claimed, no other loans, no other kinds of damages, okay. But then if he says to so-and-so, hey, come be my witnesses, we don't listen to those witnesses. Well, why not? Aren't they actually witnesses? Didn't they see it? Well, he should have brought them in the first place. If he's now soliciting witnesses on his behalf, starts to feel fishy. So the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. This matter is itself difficult. When you say, right, he can always bring proof or his claim and overturn the previous verdict, until when? Until his claims are stopped up. Well, until his claims are stopped up, with this we arrive at, this represents the opinion of the rabbis, who hold in our Mishnah that once a litigant stops presenting his claims, he cannot present additional claims later. And when you then say, until he says, come so-and-so and so-and-so and testify on my behalf, well, there we arrive at the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, that it is only in that case, when now he starts to solicit witnesses to come, that we don't allow those witnesses to come. But if he can produce additional evidence or just produce witnesses who were there, and, it's not that he's inviting them, he's not soliciting their testimony, then he can reopen the case. So exactly when do we say case closed? And if you would say that the entire statement here that's confusing us is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and Rabbi Yochanan is explaining his own statement, and what he's saying is like this. What is the meaning of the phrase, until his claims are stopped up? It means until he says, come so-and-so and so-and-so and testify on my behalf. Until he's soliciting testimony. That's when we say that his claims are dried up. But if that's the case, doesn't Rabbi Bar Chana say that Rabbi Yochanan says that anywhere that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel taught a ruling in our Mishnah, the law is in accordance with his opinion, except for those three cases. The case of the guarantor, the case in the city of Sidon, and this, the dispute with regard to evidence in the final disagreement, meaning that that's where we don't follow Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So presumably we follow the rabbis who disagree with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel about when is the case closed. So rather, the Gemara presents another version of Rabbi Yochanan's statement. When Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said that Rabbi Yochanan says, one can always bring a proof and overturn the previous verdict until his claims are stopped up, and the judges say to him, bring witnesses, and he says, I have no witnesses. And they say to him, bring evidence, and he says, I have no evidence. This is in accordance with the statement of the rabbis in the Mishnah, right? He says, I have a claim against this person. Well, now that you're in court, any claims you have about that person, you can bring them. Not just this loan that I made to him, last month, but actually I also lent him money 2 years ago and another loan 5 years ago. You can bring all those claims now. Okay? Do you have witnesses? If he says, no, I don't have witnesses. They say, do you have evidence? He says, no, I don't have evidence. Okay, well, then we're not going to hear those old claims. That's in accordance with the rabbis. But if witnesses came from overseas, or if there was a saddlebag of his father's documents deposited by another individual, which are cases where he did not know and could not know that this evidence existed, then he can bring this evidence and overturn the previous verdict, as there is no concern of artifice. Right? This is where, he can bring these witnesses that he didn't know about earlier when he said, I don't have witnesses, because he didn't know. Right? He didn't know. He wasn't like hiding it or trying to, dodge it because maybe it's not going to be so good for him, or because he's paying people to come and give false testimony. This is not fishy because new evidence turned up that he didn't know about. It's like when DNA evidence became available. Wasn't known before that. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to one who attacks another in judgment. Now we're going to a different subject. We're talking about venue now, not whether cases can be reopened or not. So when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to one who attacks another in judgment. In other words, a litigious person who keeps making claims against another. And one of the litigants says, let us go to court here, meaning here in our town. But the other litigant says, let us go to the place of the assembly, meaning let's go to Jerusalem and bring our case before the Sanhedrin or some other high court. Well, then the one who says, I just want to keep it local, he has to go to the place of assembly. Right? The one who wants to go to a higher, more authoritative court, the one who would have preferred to stay local, according to this view, has to accompany the other litigant to the high court, even if he has to travel there. But Rabbi Elazar said before him, right, before Rav Dimi, my teacher, if so, must one who claims a debt of 100 dinars from another spend 100 dinars of travel and lodging expenses in order to recover the 100 dinars that he wants to collect? Rather, one is compelled to appear and be judged in a court that presides in his own city. And that is the answer. No, the guy can't just skip to the appellate level. He can't just skip to a higher court. If one wants to bring a case, then they have to bring it locally first. And it was also stated that Rav Safra says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to two who are struggling in judgment, one of whom says, let us go to court here, and the other one says, let us go to court at the place of assembly. The latter litigant is compelled to appear and be judged in a court that presides in his own city. And if the local court needs to ask a higher court about a certain matter, the judges write to the assembly, and the higher court sends its response. Maybe one of the litigants is afraid that this case is too complicated for the local judges, and that's why he wants to go to the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. But he doesn't have that right. If indeed the case is too complicated for the local judges, they will ask. They will send a letter to the Sanhedrin and get an answer. And if one of the litigants says to a court, "Write for what reason you judge me in this manner and give it to me, as I do not trust your decision without explanation," then the judges write it and give it to him. That would seem to preserve his ability to go to the appellate case of court later, right? If the local court says, "Okay, here's your verdict," and the guy's like, "I know you got the law wrong. Please write down by what law you are judging this verdict." Then the judges have to write it down. And presumably, this litigant who lost can take that verdict with its explanation of how the judges arrived at that verdict to a higher court. And if they say, "Oh, well, they judged it wrong," he's going to be able to reopen the case at that higher court and presumably summon the other litigant at that point. And another law was stated with regard to the location of the judgment. And with regard to a woman whose husband had a brother and he died childless, she follows her brother-in-law for him to free her from yibum via chalitza. Right? We've talked about this many times. If a man is married and he has a brother, and this man dies, and he didn't have any children before he died, so now his widow and his brother have a yibum obligation to each other to get married, and their first child will be considered the heir of the man who died. But they don't have to fulfill that obligation by getting married. They just have a bond. If they decide not to get married, they do have to perform a chalitza ceremony, and then she's free to marry whoever she wants, and he goes his way too. But what if this brother lives in Jerusalem and this woman, lives in Caesarea? That's just, a drive that's not so difficult now. But in the days of walking, that could, easily take 3 or 4 or 6 or 7 days to make that walk. So in that situation, who goes where? Does she summon this brother, her brother-in-law, to come to her? Or does she have to go to Jerusalem? Answer, she has the vested interest, right? Now, as of 1,000 years ago, a man can only have one wife. But under Torah laws, it was before that, a man could have multiple wives. So that man, he could have a wife and another wife and another wife, and whether he performs yibum with his brother's widow or not doesn't really change his life that much. But she, so in other words, if he has not performed chalitza with her, he could still marry someone else. But a woman could only have one husband. So until she performs chalitza with that brother, she's not free to get married. So the burden is on her. She's going to have to travel to Jerusalem to get the chalitza ceremony performed. And the Gemara asks, how far does she have to go? And Rabbi Ami says, even from Tiberia to Tzipori. This is the law, even though the court in Tiberia is more prestigious than the one here in Tzipori, even though they have a higher court there, and this is going to be a procedure, a ritual that has to be done in front of a court. Still, the onus is on her to travel to where the brother is and go before the local court in his locale. And Rav Kahana says, well, what is the verse that alludes to this law? How do you know that she has to travel and go to where the brother is, the brother-in-law? It is the verse that states, quote, "Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. And if he stands and says, I do not wish to take her," Deuteronomy 25:8. And the fact that the Torah says the elders of his city rather than the elders of her city indicates that chalitza is performed in his city and not in hers. A Maimar says the law is that if one litigant wants to go to the place of assembly and the other does not, the latter is compelled to go to the place of assembly. Rav Ashi said to a Maimar, but doesn't Rabbi Lazar says that he's compelled to appear and be judged in a court that presides in his own city? Amemar answered, this statement applies in a case where the borrower said to the lender, let us go to the place of assembly. In that case, the debtor is compelled to be judged in his own city. But if the lender requests to go to the place of the assembly, his request is accepted. As it is stated, the borrower is the servant to the lender. And remember that when one Jew lends money to another, he's not doing it for profit, right? He cannot lend at interest. So when a Jew lends to another Jew, he's really doing him a favor. And if the borrower doesn't pay back, that's why you can see that the law very much favors the lender. And if he would like to get the case judged by a higher court, in another city, he can do that. And the sages sent a letter to Mar Ukva, the exilarch, the leader of the Jewish community in Bavel, which stated, to he who has light upon him like Moses, who is called the son of Bisya, Shalom. The letter continued, Ukvan the Babylonian complained before us as follows, Yirmiyah, my brother, came past me, i.e., did me a great evil. And therefore, tell Yirmiyah, induce him, the word for that is hasiuhu, to see our face in Tiberia, where we will judge his case. Right? So they sent a letter from Israel to the exilarch in Bavel and said, listen, you've got a guy over there who did a tremendous wrong here in Israel. We want him extradited. Send him to us. I'm almost done, so questions or comments, please get them in now. Send him to us so we can judge his case. Now, the Gemara asks, well, this matter itself is difficult to understand. You said, tell him. So apparently the intention was, judge him yourselves in Bavel. But then the letter states, induce him to see our face in Tiberia. So apparently the intention was, send him here. Okay, so one interpretation is, he did something very wrong over here, so make sure that you bring him to your court and judge him. The other interpretation is, he did a great wrong here, send him to us. So rather, this is what the sages were telling Mar Ukva. Tell him, i.e., judge him yourselves. If he listens to the court, he listens and the issue is resolved. But if he does not listen, then induce him to come see our face in Tiberia and be judged by us here. Rav Ashi said that is not the correct understanding of the letter. Rather, it was a case pertaining to the laws of fines. So what's a fine? So for example, let me just read this halakha where it came out. All fines, whether by Torah law, for example, the payment of double the principal in the case of a thief, or half the damage in the case of a innocent ox who gored, are collected only by a court of ordained judges. Therefore, fines were not collected in Bavel, and nowadays they are not collected anywhere. Right? The fine that is imposed by Torah law, that a thief pays double what he stole, that can only be imposed by an ordained judge. Right? And again, as we talked about yesterday, ordaining, or smicha, is not the same meaning as ordination today. Ordination today means, a rabbi became a rabbi, he has the title of rabbi, he can be a rabbi in a congregation, he can be a mashkiach of a restaurant, he can sit on a beis din. Those are all things that a rabbi can do. He can write a responsa, he can paskin and issue rulings on a question of law. These are all things that a rabbi can do, but that doesn't make him a sage. Semicha, or ordination, what we're talking about it in the Gemara, is talking about, was somebody elevated to the level of a sage? And it was only sages who could impose fines according to Torah law. And we don't have sages at that level today. Even if we have the great rabbis of a generation, they're still not called sages like they are in the Gemara, because they lived in the wrong age. We don't have sages anymore. They haven't been for a long time. So That's what they were talking about even then. Are we talking about judges of the level of sages who could impose these fines or not? Rav Ashi said that is not the correct understanding of the letter. Rather, it was a case pertaining to the laws of fines. And in Bavel, the courts do not adjudicate in cases pertaining to the laws of fines. Even though there were great Amoraim, sages of the Gemara in Bavel, they're not at that level where they could adjudicate fines like the earlier sages and some later sages in Eretz Yisrael. Consequently, it was necessary to send the case to Eretz Yisrael. And the fact that they sent the letter to Mar Ukva using this wording, as though he were capable of adjudicating the case himself, was in order to give honor to Mar Ukva, who was a sage and a leader, but there was a law at that time that we don't adjudicate cases of fines in Bavel. Those kinds of cases had to go back to Eretz Yisrael, even though there were sages in Bavel. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6, and with it, that concludes chapter 3 here in Tractate Sanhedrin. And tomorrow, Thursday, at the regular Thursday time, 6 p.m. Pacific, we'll pick up chapter 4. Let's just take a few questions. Okay, Bill, hold on. I've gotten a little confused as to the logic. So, if two witnesses disagree on the type of weapon, but within what sounds to me like the same class of weapons, a sword and, per the note, a bent sword or knife, where they agree it was a slashing weapon made with a metal blade but dispute the size and shape, that's too much distance in their testimony. Contrary-wise, the physical description of the clothing that the murderer was wearing is not relevant. Why on earth not? Surely there's some real distance between seeing a man in black run out of a bank vault carrying bags of cash and seeing a man in white do the same thing. In a modern court, this would be considered a real problem with the testimony of the two witnesses. I think you're right. If the witnesses were simply saying, I saw a man in black or I saw a man in white commit that crime. But it sounds like what the witnesses are saying is, I saw Tom Jones kill, Pete Smith. And the other one says, I saw Tom Jones kill Pete Smith. And then when they ask for more details, one of them says, well, Tom Jones was wearing black, and the other one says Tom Jones was wearing white. But these are witnesses who know both the killer and the victim, and they're disagreeing about what is in that situation secondary details. If the only identifying mark of the killer was what he was wearing, that might be something else. And then I see exactly what you're saying. But I'm just guessing there's more context to what we're learning here. Joe, as far as testimony of weapons, one sounded like he had the vocabulary to be more specific in identifying a weapon. Couldn't they give paper and pen to each and ask them to draw a picture of what they saw? If both pictures showed a long curved blade, would their testimony be congruent? Yeah, I think so. I think that would be a wonderful way to get at it, right? I think what they're saying is this is kind of the kinds of categories of details where we could raise a question. But it's not, they disagree on the type of knife, it's dismissed, or they disagree on the color of the clothing, it's not dismissed. I think they would have to weigh all these factors in making a decision, but we're talking about the types of details that could tilt this in one way or the other. That's how I'm reading it. Sharon, was there an equivalent of a notarized document? Sounds like yeah, right? When we talked yesterday about where you have three who are going to write down, a statement of admission, they're acting as a court. Right? And a court can write it down and then have witnesses sign it. And that's more than just a witness document, right? When it's witnessed and written before a court, or where it's witnessed and then ratified before a court, which is to say that the document with the witnesses that signed on it comes to the court and the witnesses say, yeah, I signed that. That's my signature, which would certainly be the case if they did the signing in a court. I think that is the equivalent of a notarized document. And last question, Yosef says, if there is a contradiction between witnesses in a capital case, If not simply mistaken facts, then it is possible that blackmail, coercion, or entrapment may be involved. Would they be suspicious of this and investigate? Yeah, right. So the question is, what kinds of discrepancies do we have, and how did they pop up? Is it simply that the witnesses basically saw the same thing, but they're misremembering certain details, which is just very human, but we can accept their testimonies and then evaluate, just what we think they're saying? Or, are the discrepancies fundamental? And aside from just simply comparing the witness testimonies to each other, how did we get these witnesses in our court in the first place? Was there something fishy? Like the guy said, I don't have witnesses, and then he said he does have witnesses. And it's not that the witnesses showed up from overseas. It's that he claims, well, I didn't know there were witnesses, and then they came to my house and said, no, we saw it. Well, why did they speak up now and they didn't speak up earlier? How did that happen? It sounds like the judges are investigating, and they are going to look at all these details to see what's fishy and what's not. So it's not that, the Gemara is laying out every possibility and every detail. It's just giving us, some touchstones that the judges could then use to conduct their investigation and make their conclusions. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday, regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.